of emergency. So under Minnesota statute, section 13D.021, we're holding this meeting virtually. Everybody knows how to do that, but if you're tuning in from a public line, either on audio or visually, if you'd like to make any comments, please email us at info@metc.state.mn.us, and we'll respond in a timely manner, but at least we'll get a chance to hear your comments, see your comments. As a call to order, I think Bridget is here somewhere, is going to...
I am here.
You can call the roll.
All right, Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen. Atlas Ingebrigtsen. Barber. Here. Chambliss.
Here.
Cummings.
Here.
Fredson.
Here.
Gonzalez. Gonzalez. Johnson.
Here.
Lee.
Here.
Lilligren.
Here.
Lindstrom.
Here.
Muse.
Here.
Sterner. Sterner. Vento.
Here.
Wolf.
Here.
Zirin.
Present.
Chair Zelli.
I am here. Great. Welcome, everyone. And now the approval of the agenda, which is 2 information items. Unless I hear an objection, I will consider the agenda to be approved. Which brings us to approval of the minutes of the meeting of the Committee of the Whole of August 19th. Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved, Lindstrom.
Vento seconds.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Sue. Any discussion? If not, Bridget, call the roll.
Atlas Ingebrigtsen. Atlas Ingebrigtsen. Barber.
Aye.
Chambliss.
Aye.
Cummings.
Aye.
Fredson.
Hi.
Gonzalez. Gonzalez. Johnson.
Here. Aye. Sorry.
Lee.
Hi.
Lilligren.
Aye.
Lindstrom.
Aye.
Muse.
Aye.
Sterner. Sterner. Vento.
Aye.
Wolf.
Aye.
Zirin.
Aye.
Chair Zelli.
Aye. The minutes stand approved. And now to the information items. Rethinking areas of concentrated poverty. We have both Kristen Reba Torres and Matt Schroeder, who gave us a presentation very briefly and have been very patient, but I have been reviewing this PowerPoint for over a month, and I'm really interested in hearing from them, and we can think thoughtfully about how this affects the work of our work at the council. So, Kristen, take it away.
Thank you so much, Chair Zelli. We too have been looking forward to the conversation with you all today. So thank you for having us back to discuss rethinking areas of concentrated poverty. I guess before I go further, I just want to make sure you can hear me.
You're coming in loud and clear.
Wonderful.
Perfect.
Thank you. Okay. Before we get into today's presentation, I just have a few acknowledgments, if you'll indulge me. We want to be really clear with you today that some of what we're going to talk about are ideas that have been brought forward by local community organizers, advocates, and academics who have really talked about these ideas for years. And we're not here to represent that work as our own, but rather just to lift up these ideas and bring them into this discussion. And we want to say that we really appreciate the ways that they've challenged us both directly and indirectly in this work. Second, I want to really thank all the stakeholders that we've engaged so far. This is a lot of council staff, staff at local jurisdictions, the council's Equity Advisory Committee, and of course you all for having us in December as well as today. You know, these discussions were really candid and sometimes contentious because they touch upon some of the most complex and painful issues in our region. And we just really appreciate both their and your willingness to, you know, quote, go there with us. The conversation is far from over. It's really just beginning, but thank you so much for the insights shared so far. And lastly, I want to give a shout out to our data science intern. Her name is Amy Planbeck. And her first assignment was coming into this work and helping us with the digital report that was shared with you at the end of July, and we can share it again in the chat. We really appreciate her work on this, and it was a heavy lift right out of the gate. She did wonderful, so thank you, Amy. All right, with that, I'll proceed. Next slide, please, Greg. So today we have kind of two levels of discussion that we hope to have with you. We want to share some key findings from the Rethinking Concentrated Poverty project so far, which are largely captured in the digital report. You know, but our time is limited, and our intention is to listen more than we talk. So we've only brought forward a few of the points from the report, which goes into more detail. So please refer to that for more information. You know, we began this project over a year ago with a sense of urgency to change what had become our status quo. And our feelings about that only grew stronger as the work started to take shape, and we heard consistent themes that we'll be sharing with you today. So we have taken some immediate action where we could, and we'll share that with you today and ask for your reactions on those decisions and any, you know, comments, input, refinements you'd like to see. And then we want to talk a little bit longer term. It's very clear to us that pieces of this work will require more time and resources and deep community partnership. So in addition to talking about what we've done so far, we'd also like to discuss with you where you'd like to see this future research go, and what, in your view, are the core questions at the heart of place-based equity. And again, just to really be clear about terms here, when we use the phrase place-based equity, what we mean is that no matter where you live in our 7-county region, you have choices, you can realize success, and you can thrive. Place-based strategies need to improve the lives of people. They need to be people-centered strategies. And you know, these are really the ideas at the heart of our discussion today. And so many of you touched on these ideas during the recent discussions on the regional economic framework, so it seems so timely to be continuing this discussion and maybe delving a bit more deeply into those. Next slide, please. Again, to be clear, you know, there are a lot of studies of concentrated poverty out there. So we're talking today, though, about the Council's annual Areas of Concentrated Poverty Analysis, or ACPs for short. We identify census tracts region-wide that meet the poverty threshold described on the slide using the American Community Survey 5-year estimates published by the U.S. Census Bureau. We also identify subsets of areas of concentrated poverty where the majority of residents are people of color, or ACPs, ACP 50s for short. Matt will talk a little bit more about ACPs later. Next slide, please. This annual work originated with the Council's 2014 Fair Housing and Equity Assessment, a report required by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and its grantees. Every FHEA had a checklist of components, one of which was a study of concentrated poverty. It also included an analysis of opportunity and fair housing issues region-wide, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Concentrated poverty intersected with race and explored over time was intended to provide a shared understanding of whether and to what degree the principles of the Fair Housing Act were being realized in a particular metro area. So this was the intent behind the measure as this snapshot of residential segregation. Our FHEA was informed and certainly improved by community organizers, advocates, and other regional stakeholders, and is available online. There's a link in the slides that will work. Thank you. Next slide, please. As the Fair Housing and Equity Assessment work was underway, the region's development guide was being drafted, as was the council's policy plan, housing policy plan rather. These two documents incorporated the measure of concentrated poverty and framed it as a key equity challenge for our region. This really cemented its place in the regional narrative, and it's also why we maintain an annual data set and why you see it pop up in various equity metrics, like in the Thrive indicators and housing policy plan indicators. We bring up this point in this context to just highlight that we are at a similar crossroads now. You know, the very early stages of developing the next 10-year planning guide are underway. And so now is really the right time to call this question on whether concentrated poverty and our focus on it has helped to advance regional equity or not. The research that we initiate now and findings that we produce over the next several years will inform those guiding policy documents yet to come. And I think, Brad, could you just click quickly? See if that does any, yes, thank you. So that's why we're kind of calling this question and calling attention to the timing of this work, because it can really help to shape those policy documents, and it can also help to shape council policies and practices too. Next slide, please. Over the last, I think it's been about 18 months now, we've talked with a lot of the primary users of our analysis, council staff, staff at local governments, and our research counterparts at various agencies. We asked them if and how they use areas of concentrated poverty in their work, if it has been helpful to them, and if so, why, and if not, why not, and what other tools or data would be helpful in thinking about place-based strategies to benefit people. We've also been following conversations led by others and have paid careful attention to the new research studies that intersect with this topic. And there has been quite a bit that has emerged since 2014 when the Fair Housing and Equity Assessment was produced. Next slide. These are the high-level themes from that listening. In short, there were real benefits to a shared analysis at a regional scale, and that's really encouraging to us. For example, a few jurisdictions told us that absent the ACP analysis, their various departments would have had to develop their own geographic areas of concern, a project that would have taken considerable time and resources. So there was a real benefit to having a vetted layer produced by the council and that was updated annually. But it was also clear that concentrated poverty as a standalone measure is inadequate. It reflects an outcome, not a problem in and of itself. To really advance regional equity, specifically racial equity, we must lift up the systemic and structural dynamics that created concentrated poverty and the conditions that sustain it today. And then lastly, the narratives, data, and decisions surrounding areas of concentrated poverty hold tension and discomfort at all levels. You know, we heard a lot about the balance between too much investment or what kind of investment, and then what if that results in gentrification and displacement? So that, you know, that level of conversation and those tensions and discomforts are at all levels of stakeholders that we've talked with. Next slide, please. When we talked with you in December, we've summarized some of the main takeaways that we had. I'm just going to highlight a few points here. You know, we heard that you understood and shared our concerns about placing too much emphasis on one particular data point, of course, being concentrated poverty. Bringing parity to that with additional data and perhaps an analysis of concentrated wealth was a good idea. Also, that we needed to make sure that this continues to be a regional discussion, both in geography and in our engagement, and really be thoughtful about that approach. Next slide, please. We also talked with the Equity Advisory Committee last July, so a few months before we talked with you in December. And they brought forward several ideas that we wanted to call out from the engagement because they were both really important to the direction of our work, and they also demonstrate a few areas of overlap. The EAC affirmed to us that the deficit-based narrative of ACPs is problematic, and they also challenged us how to think about research that results from this work as being co-owned by community. We're still thinking about that and ways we can enact that. Both you council members as well as the Equity Advisory Committee shared the following. You urged us to explore different data sources, including mixed methods to get at quantitative and qualitative insights. You both shared an interest in including an analysis of concentrated wealth and racially restricted covenants. And you also asked us to help you better understand how council decisions, including services and investments, were contributing to neighborhood change, especially in areas of concentrated poverty. So those were some of the shared takeaways in talking with both groups. Next slide, please. So we reflected on everything we heard and that we've been taking in over this time period. And we really call out reflection as distinct from listening and learning because there's an element of personal contact with that, and there's also just really putting everything in context and thinking really intentionally about where to go from here. And we bring forward these 3 points with you today. First is that concentrated poverty was perhaps not the most useful finding or concept to bring forward from the choice place and opportunity equity assessment. We question whether fewer census tracts identified as concentrated poverty on a map is in fact equity. And worse, that overemphasizing this descriptive outcome has really distracted from its root causes, the systemic and structural failings that underpin concentrated poverty and have resulted in the worst racial inequities in the US. Second, this isn't just about maybe frustrating stereotypes. Last year, the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the University of Minnesota, they published a mixed method study about gentrification and displacement. And in their interviews with community organizations, those organizations describe the narrative of concentrated poverty as having real, tangible effect on disinvestment and devaluation of their neighborhoods. And it was something they had to actively counteract and emphasize community needs apart and aside from what the connotations that may come with concentrated poverty. Lastly, concentrated poverty doesn't begin to describe the scale or scope of poverty in our region. And in fact, the majority of residents living in poverty in our region live outside of these areas. It can also mask other dynamics too, like gentrification, which can take the form of a growing share of high-income residents alongside a large share of high-poverty residents until a tipping point is reached and displacement occurs. So for those reasons and many others, we felt confident that we needed to rethink this focus on concentrated poverty. And I'm going to turn it over to Matt to talk a little bit about what that has looked like in the short term.
Thanks, Kristen, and thanks, council members. Kristen just talked about the many reasons that we've been taking stock of this, of our research into this, and why we're taking responsibility for how we've created real harms. But taking responsibility means more than just acknowledging that we have created harm. It means also repairing what we've done and doing better in the future. So if you'll click to the next slide, Greg, please. You will see our plans for what we're doing now and in the future. We, as much of a sense of urgency as we, and I think you all feel around this, we also know that we want to take a more thoughtful and deliberate approach to avoid reproducing the same problems that we're facing right now. And so, though we can't get to everything extremely soon, this is what we're hoping to do. Immediately, we are changing the data set that we publish. We have, as Kristen mentioned, for the past several years, been releasing a data set that really just includes the bare minimum, a binary race classification, whites versus people of color, and the poverty rate, and really just the basics necessary to define areas of concentrated poverty in order to be transparent about how we calculate them. We're now adding many characteristics that I'll mention in a little bit in order to support the shift in the regional narrative and enable people to get a more nuanced picture of neighborhoods. And along the way, we'll also be developing guidance and technical assistance for users who take up that data set. Second, we also heard really clearly that we need to stop speaking on behalf of community members and center their voices instead. And so we'll be initiating more research soon that listens to communities in order to amplify their wisdom and their skills and voices. We really want to capture the advances in the regional equity landscape that have happened since choice, place, and opportunity. And finally, we want to drive this out into the region. So we're going to do everything we can to make sure that the findings of this research are available to inform the next regional planning cycle, as well as feedback into the council's own policies and practices. If you'll click, Greg, please. It's really the first two of these that we'll be focusing on today. So I'll talk about the data right now, and then Kristen will pick back up with the future research agenda. Next slide, please. So first, as Kristen mentioned, we heard you and a lot of other stakeholders ask for data on high income areas to kind of balance out the scales a bit. And so we're now identifying areas of concentrated affluence. And these are areas that we defined following a literature review of how other people have analyzed this subject as areas where about 2/3 of residents are affluent, defined in turn as having an income of about 5 times the federal poverty threshold. So it's defined similarly to ACPs, but just the other end of the income spectrum. So as I said, we're hoping that this balances the scales and puts the focus more on this regional landscape of segregation by income rather than only concentrated poverty. And I will also mention that we know that this map is not perfect. We heard from Community Development Director Lisa Barajas recently that pointing out that a lot of areas around Lake Minnetonka where with very high home values, a lot of wealth is concentrated, don't appear in this map, which is because this is an income-based definition. These are areas where likely incomes of people have fallen in retirement and aren't quite high enough to hit that affluent threshold, but where people still have substantial savings and investments that they've accumulated over the years. And so we want to definitely keep on refining what this looks like in conversation with you and other stakeholders. Next slide, please. We also want to provide some information on how places became lower income or higher income. And we've talked about before in the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, this had a lot to do with redlining, that it was a lot harder to get mortgages in areas with many people of color, especially Black and African-American residents. It's harder to see it in this static map, but our online report does allow you to look at the overlap of areas of concentrated poverty and areas of concentrated affluence on these redlining zones. And while, again, it's not a perfect correspondence, it's pretty striking. So what we're providing now is the share of each tract's total area that's in each of those different redlining zones. Next slide, please. And going a little farther back in time, we also heard from you and others that racially restrictive covenants played a large role in shaping both the redlining patterns in Minneapolis and St. Paul, but also residential patterns in the cities, in the suburbs. And again, it's hard to see here, but there's a lot of overlap between these areas, the blue blobs on the map, where only white people could buy property until 1948, when covenants were struck down by the Supreme Court, and the redlining grades, as well as those low-income and high-income areas today. And so because this has had a lasting effect on property values and therefore on the distribution of wealth and and the racial distribution throughout the Twin Cities. We're also interested in helping people see that correspondence. So we're now providing the number of racially restrictive covenants in each census tract, as well as the share of today's single-family homes that had them. We do want to acknowledge the Mapping Prejudice Project that graciously provided their raw data to enable a tract-based analysis of this. We are hoping that as they produce more data, I think they're working on Ramsey County right now, that we'll be able to add more tracts that are outside Hennepin County. But for now, what we have is just Hennepin County. Next slide, please. Some other big news, as Kristen suggested earlier, is that we are no longer explicitly identifying those areas of concentrated poverty where at least 50% of residents are people of color. We're allowing people to, we're giving people the information in the data set that they need to do this if they want, while cautioning against that. But we are not providing an explicit indicator for ACP 50s. And the real reason there is that people tend to make an automatic association between poverty and people of color, that all people of color are in poverty and that most residents of high poverty areas are people of color. And really neither of those is true. And so to kind of undercut that general stereotype that people make and to avoid creating too close an identity between race and poverty, we are kind of pulling these apart. Also, we are wanting to discourage people from, again, that binary classification of white people on the one hand versus people from many, many different racial and ethnic groups and cultures into the general people of color category. And so toward that end, we're also providing the full distribution of all those groups that the American Community Survey defines, along with an indicator of the largest group in each tract to really highlight the diversity across all of our neighborhoods, regardless of income scale. We know, as we've talked about with many of you, that this is not perfect, that the ACS does really not provide a lot of granular detail on all of the different groups that we would want to capture. And we're thinking of ways to do that in the future. But for now, at least, emphasizing the full distribution with African Americans and Black residents, Asian residents, Hispanic and Latinx residents, Indigenous residents, and so on, will help highlight that diversity. Next slide, please. We've also grown concerned that decision makers are using ACPs as a proxy for all kinds of needs, even though there's a lot of variation across high poverty neighborhoods. So the phrase that we mentioned in December and that we've continued to use since is that these areas of concentrated poverty share a poverty rate, but not much else. They look very different with respect to vehicle ownership, with respect to race, housing type, and so on. And so to enable a more well-rounded picture of the census tracts in our data set, we're including housing data like home ownership rate and housing cost burden and housing costs, as well as some transportation relevant characteristics like households without vehicles and commute lengths. Again, we know that this is only a limited slice. This is what we could do most quickly and push out to our users as a foundation to build on. And if you'll click to the next slide, Greg, please. You'll see some characteristics that we are hoping to provide later this year. So we're hoping to provide not just data on those more granular race categories, including immigrant categories, immigrants, recent immigrants to the Twin Cities, as well as how they rate their English proficiency, also disability status. In the development and landscape category, we're wanting to provide more information on the flows of investments into different neighborhoods and out of different neighborhoods. So mortgage lending, commercial and economic development, to kind of really dig into those questions that you and Equity Advisory Committee members encouraged us to look at. And then, because we know that a lot of governmental staff in the council and in local governments as well need to use various federal designations to talk about what they're doing to advance equity. These are opportunity zones, qualified census tracts, economically distressed areas, and so on. We're going to be pulling in indicators of those into the data, understanding that people will need to continue using those, but also wanting to help them add some context to those designations with all the other data that we're providing. So again, we're doing what we do best, I think, and pulling together a lot of different data sources, summarizing it in a way that is easier to use and easier to understand, and making that more useful for people who can do something about it. Next slide, please. We've heard along the way that since we published this new data set, that our users are totally understanding of why we did this and appreciative of the work that we've done to rethink our approach to this data set. They're less sure, I think, about how to incorporate it into their work. How to, if they're interested in, for example, analyzing how well they're serving different neighborhoods, which characteristics in this new data set might they want to look at? And so we've already started this, but we'll continue to have conversations with those users to develop not just a list of general tips and considerations, but a list of possible reasons why people would use the data set, as well as our suggestions for what they might want to look at for each of those possible uses. And along the way, we will also be incorporating into this guidance and assistance some recommendations, links to other resources for authentic engagement, because we know that from our own experience, simply adding more layers to a map may do a lot to add some nuance to our portrait of neighborhoods, but it doesn't necessarily fix the underlying problem, which is that low-income areas and communities of color have been excluded from discussions of policies that affect their lives. And so we will also be encouraging our users to engage communities themselves, as well as encourage the policymakers that they're in contact with to engage with communities. And now I will turn it back to Kristen to talk about what comes after that with our upcoming research.
Thanks, Matt. Next slide, please, Greg. So that was a lot already. I just want to acknowledge that. That's the near, that is sort of the right now and near term. And we do want to hear your comments, questions about the changes that Matt just described. I just have a few more slides to talk about what the longer term research agenda is shaping up to be, but there is so much room for co-creation and additional ideas, and that's also what we hope to hear from you. So a couple of studies that are planned, two projects in particular where we hope to bring this lens of place and equity to existing work, and maybe call some findings that are useful to bring into our data set. The first is the residential preferences of low-income households. This would be a collaboration with the Metro HRA and several other public housing authorities in the region on a mixed method study, likely some combination of surveys and interviews, to really understand the residential preferences, and including those who are using vouchers and those who may not be using vouchers. We will bring any key findings from that study into this work to lift up what those preferences are and things that folks should be keeping in mind as they're making decisions. I do want to just flag that this project was talked about pre-pandemic, and so its fate is yet to be determined, but we still certainly hope it proceeds and that we have the resources to do it. The second is a project that I think you all have heard at least a little something about, which is the Economic Values Atlas. This is the same partnerships from the Regional Economic Framework with the additions of the Brookings Institute. And we are hoping that, this is also a project that's largely about a place and decisions about infrastructure and major investments. And so as we move through that project, which involves an intensive community engagement component, we'll also be thinking about how how the findings of that work intersect with the questions we're asking today on place and equity. And beyond that, this is where things start to get a little more blue sky, but exciting nonetheless. Opportunities to really, work together to think about what future research could accomplish. We will have fresh 2020 census data to work with. So we do want to leverage that in future work, but also recognizing the limitations of existing data and opportunities to develop further local data that really brings forward neighborhood assets and histories in new ways that can really, again, create that shared understanding that folks found so useful about the Choice, Place, and Opportunity report. Future research that we undertake will be community-centered, and that does mean partnerships, and we've taken some excellent points from Councilmember Atlas-Singer-Bretson and others who have pointed out what makes for the best collaborations and centers equity in the process of that work, not just in the with the research question in mind. So we thank you for that input, and we look forward to hearing more from you on that. And, again, we don't want to get too far down the road here, because we want to engage not just on the questions themselves, but in what the questions should be. And so normally we wouldn't come to you with something that is as tentative as this may sound, but it really is in a spirit of collaboration that we're doing so. Next slide, please. We did have the opportunity to talk with the Equity Advisory Committee on July 21st and share the findings from this work to date that we just shared with you, as well as ask for some of their ideas about this future research. And they had some great ideas. First is really focusing on neighborhood economies and the extent to which there are retail and service gaps that could help strengthen those local economies and bring more economic prosperity to low wealth neighborhoods. So that is something we want to explore, and something that certainly overlaps with some of our other research initiatives. Second was, continuing to get better information on BIPOC and immigrant-owned businesses and entrepreneurship data. We don't have great data here, and certainly there are enough folks who are interested in this, who want to better understand these issues and how to address and expand opportunities. So this is something we need to look at how we can get better information. And it's something that the Equity Advisory Committee certainly felt passionate about. And lastly, they wanted to talk about residential patterns within neighborhoods. So what are the new developments and infrastructure that have been going into places? What are the housing cost trends and other real estate activity? And any other indicators of displacement that we could develop and track to better understand what the neighborhood trajectories in the region are, and where interventions and or opportunities could be identified. Next slide. So that brings us to our discussion. And again, hoping to hear from you any comments on the information Matt shared about some of the changes to our data set. And or anything regarding the future research that we want to undertake to better center equity in place-based decisions. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Chair Zelli.
Well, thank you, Kristen. And Matt, this is, we appreciate that this is a groundbreaking work, and it's also a work in process. So, and that is helpful, and also acknowledge that you've invited us to be just part of that process now, today, and then in the past and going forward. So let's open it up. Any comments, thoughts? Anybody there? No, I just the boxes keep switching. It's making my eyes hurt. Councilmember Chambliss, I see your hand up.
Thank you for this presentation. I too was very excited that we finally got a chance to talk about the areas of concentrated poverty, because it impacts so much of the work that we do to have thriving communities. I'm not exactly sure how we got to changing the way that we look at areas of concentrated poverty, where there's several meetings. I'd be interested in knowing um, how much participation and where the participation sources came from. Engagement and information is so crucial as we move to change our strategic plans, and making sure that as we move in the direction, we're not kind of throwing away the baby with the bathwater, and we're respecting the um, the original efforts on looking at concentrated poverty. I think there's a possibility that you can look at concentrations of poverty, and I see that we're looking at that and looking at affluence, but I'm not quite sure, how do we unpack the impact and the reason for looking at areas of concentrated affluence and what we plan to do with that. And having a strategic plan would give me more information on where we want to go, what our priorities are, and why we're doing what we're doing. So I'm looking forward to seeing that aspect of this plan. And I want to encourage people to be very careful about getting, some information, running with it, and moving from point A to point B. Our response should be to build upon existing knowledge. Um, and I think that's what we're doing, but just being very, very cautious that we're just not shifting and moving without it being a full strategic initiative and adding it to some of our core values as a part of that. So I'd like to hear more about that. Really glad that we're talking about the sources of how we get to these areas of concentrated poverty, which closely follow race, um, and how we're going to address that would be through a strategic plan again. So I'm hoping that that's going to be a part of it, and it also the strategic approach ensures that we're moving in a direction that gives us positive gains. If we move to expanding throughout the region of where poverty is, we got to look at strategically what is our capacity, what are our resources, what can we handle. Are we stretching ourselves out too thin, or should we have a strategic approach that's going to get us to the goal? So I guess that's it. I'd like to suggest that we look at the next step, and is that going to be a strategic plan?
Kristen?
Thank you for the comment, Councilmember Chambliss. And I think that there are certainly, as Matt and I are talking about the changes to the data, and again, we didn't change the way we're measuring areas of concentrated poverty, but rather added that concentrated affluence. I think as we go complete our in-reach efforts, so talking with more of our council staff about these changes, about how they might be useful to them, I think that will kind of culminate in a document that Matt described of guidance and technical assistance, and that it will enter into strategic planning efforts. We want to, at this stage, we're really getting feedback and trying to raise awareness, but I think your idea of having to be strategic and really both understand the uses across the council, but then also how this furthers both existing work or future work is extremely important to capture and to be intentional about. So I think that will be, definitely part of our next steps. Matt, do you have anything to add? Or Chair Zelle, of course?
No, thank you. Other than just to say that I'm transcribing these comments as closely as I can.
Well, I was just going to say, I think it's a really important question, and maybe this is how we lead to our larger, Thrive Next plan, strategic plan. But part of what I'm hearing, if I get this right, Reva, is like, what are we trying to accomplish with this? Where are the goals to focus? This is this is more than an academic study, which is fascinating. But like, what are we changing? What are we bending? And let's put a stake in the ground some places, place-based.
Exactly. Exactly. Thank you, Chair. I just had one more thing.
Yeah,
and that
go ahead.
is on page 20, there was input from the Equity Advisory Committee, and I'm so glad we're starting to see more of that input coming forward. There's a bullet, they're talking about neighborhood economies, local disaggregated BIPOC data, which I think is crucial in order to meet the specific needs of neighborhoods and communities. And then it also lists immigrant-owned businesses and entrepreneur data. I'd like to learn more about, you know, the reason that that's highlighted. Is there an issue with immigrant-owned businesses or lack thereof? What about non-immigrant-owned businesses that are BIPOC? So I'm looking forward to hearing more about that later. You don't have to address it now, but just wanted to bring that up. Thank you.
No, I've lost people on the screen, but if I know there's a few other questions and comments we had. Councilmember Lee.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for this wonderful presentation. I have one suggestion and then a couple comments. My suggestion is that at the end of your presentation, you mentioned that we could use more data on businesses and entrepreneurs of color. And I suggest connecting with Bruce Corey. He's an academic at Concordia in St. Paul. He was, in the first year of Mayor Carter's administration, he was the director of planning and economic development, but he stepped down to go back to be an academic. And that's his specialty, is research in the ethnic minority groups here in Minnesota and their economic impact and their entrepreneurship. And I really appreciate the metrics that we're talking about here, in particular, the future of disaggregating data around race and ethnicity. And also looking at the localized history of place. Place is very important. Some of the earliest laws and ordinances against discrimination in the Twin Cities began in Minneapolis in the 1960s as a reaction to rising anti-Semitism. And we have to look at confronting our history of systems of oppression and white supremacy. They affect even white folks too. But we have to remember that this is not a zero-sum game when we look at the past and we try to move forward. So thank you.
And how recent that history is that's shaped the communities we're living in today. It's just quite astounding, that research. Thank you, Councilmember. Other comments, questions? Councilmember Vento.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm curious, and this doesn't require an answer tonight. It may be something, Kristen and Matt, that you would want to go back and look at, but I'm wondering if there's any ability to project shifts. I'm particularly focused on what related to COVID, what related to the impact of George Floyd's death. Are there any of those types of societal factors that could impact future shifts in these ACPs that might help us in our planning? I'm also curious as to how this information is shared elsewhere. And I'm thinking particularly about how beneficial this information would be for school districts, particularly for school districts and probably for nonprofits and all sorts of other organizations. But it just seems like a valuable resource that I don't think we want to hang on to too tight. And then the last thing I wanted to mention was whether or not in the conversations, there was any conversation about the elderly and the impact of concentrated poverty on people who are elderly living in those areas.
Matt, Kristen.
I'm just trying to think back to the various discussions that we had, Councilmember Vento, about with jurisdictions. And certainly there was discussions of intersectionality, right? Where it's not just about race or just about age or income, where all of those factors coalesce, and in describing vulnerable communities or marginalized communities from process. So I think that was probably the level at which it was described, nothing explicitly about elderly residents. There were sometimes passing references to long-term residents, and that may or may not always be the same sort of point of reference. But certainly that long-term residents and residents that are newer to a place and their various ideas about displacement, gentrification, and so on, that was a theme that did come up. But I don't recall anything specifically about the elderly, though certainly, again, trying to get at disaggregated data, trying to get at intersectional data is something that is going to be important for us to be thinking about as we move through this work. So thank you for that question.
Mr. Chair, I have one other comment.
Sure.
I had an opportunity several years ago to hear one of the leaders from the Mapping Project talk about their work. It was at a Martin Luther King celebration at Joan of Arc. And if we ever have an opportunity during a committee of the whole or during a community development committee or whenever to have them come in and present, I learned so much during that presentation and just found it really beneficial and frankly quite eye-opening. So just a thought.
I'm going to follow up on something Councilmember Vento asked when you talked about school districts and all those that would benefit. And part of your presentation is that we're doing a little consulting or advising. Are we doing that now? Is it municipalities that are outside some of our stakeholders who are benefiting from some of this work, or is it individual developers? Is that something that informs some of our livable grant making activity?
Mr. Chair and Councilmember Vento, I can't speak to Livable Communities Act programs specifically, but in terms of the assistance that we have been providing, it has mostly been with local government staff. I can't recall any conversations with developers, but I think we've seen as a result of this project that we need to be a bit more proactive about that assistance rather than waiting for people to come to us.
Right. That's good to know. Anyone else?
Chair, I've had my hand up, but I'm not sure if you're using that or a different method, so I thought I would just type in.
Go ahead. You're not on my screen, Linnea, but go ahead. Your video is off, but go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I'm using my phone to call in today to ensure quality of continuity in the call.
No problem.
Thank you. I want to thank the team for this presentation. I think it's important that that we acknowledge we need a whole toolbox of information to inform our work and that of our communities going forward. And so I appreciate hearing that. I think one thing that has continuously been a challenge in the year and a half for me is our use and understanding of what I'm going to call proportional representativeness. And so what I mean by that is when you look at advancing equity, a way of understanding one data point of where you're at is to look at the different aspects of the work that you're doing and how proportional, how representative of it is it of the proportion of the communities that are represented within the geography you're serving. And that might change by the type of work we're doing if we're talking parks versus the population we're serving wastewater, it might change, or you're looking at a local community versus the whole region. And one of the first things that I asked for when I joined the council was demographic and information. Would have been great to have information like this for the constituency that I represented for District 6. What was the demographic aggregated information so that I could start looking and seeing, are we proportionally representative in the work that we're doing that comes up as I started working in my space. So I think that one of the things that would be a nice tool to have as a part of this work, and MN Compass has an example of this on their website. They have Minnesota's cultural communities. If you go to mncompass.org and select data by topic, and then their special projects, one of their special projects is cultural communities. And they've identified the 26th largest cultural communities in Minnesota, and you can see all kinds of information about those cultural groups. It disaggregates African American, Mexican, Native American, Hmong, Somali, Indian, Chinese, Vietnamese, Ethiopian, Korean, Filipino, Liberian, Lao, Puerto Rican, Salvadoran, Burmese, Guatemalan, Cambodian, Japanese, Ecuadorian, Kenyan, Cambodian, Lebanese, Thai, and Cuban, Native American. Those are the 26 largest cultural groups, and then white non-Hispanic in our state. And they've broken out information about them. That, knowing what that largest groups are for the metropolitan region, and for a district to know their demographic information is really helpful information for a council member to know when they're starting. But I'd also love to see this information provided as a part of what we give to local communities when they're starting their comp planning process. Some communities, and I would argue some school districts have better data than we do, because they're dealing with our future population that we often don't think enough about. But there are many of our local communities that are really strapped for resources and time, and don't have the resources, time, and knowledge to pull this kind of data together. So I'd really like to see this information provided in the comp planning process to local communities. Whether they take it or not, or use it or not, is up to them, but I think it can be a value add that we provide. I think it's also really good, because of the nature of our work is planning, to disaggregate that data by age, so that you can see who's the population 10 years from now versus the population that we often focus on, which is the adult population, working population. When you do that in a district like mine, all of a sudden you're dealing with maybe 100 languages spoken as opposed to maybe 10 or 12 is what people sometimes work on. And honestly, most local communities might be thinking about 3 or 4, maybe 5. And so I think it gives us a chance to really be able to be future minded in the context of planning. The last piece of that is that in order to start moving equity forward, moving towards representational representativeness in our proportionality of those communities, of those 26 largest cultural groups in the state. My guess is maybe that would be the same for the metro area. But when we don't know that information, we can't make good decisions around it. So I hope that made sense. And if it didn't, I'm happy to answer questions about it, provide clarity.
Thank you, Linnea, for providing that perspective. And I want to note for everybody that in the chat box, Matt has added a link to the Minnesota Compass data and reports that on cultural communities that Linnea was referring. Any reaction? And really, that's anybody, but Kristen and Matt certainly.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Adler-Singer-Bretson, yes, I believe I remember that request and pulling all that together, which was really rewarding to give council members an idea of the characteristics of their district, even though we could not get the full detail on race that you and others have asked for. I'll mention briefly that we do have some ability to summarize these cultural communities within the region as is. We've adapted their, the original approach by the State Demographic Center and taken off a bit on what they did. And so we can summarize data for very large geographic areas for those cultural communities. So if it would be useful, I'm happy to look at our ability to at least how those would map onto council districts and if there's anything we can say about that.
Great. Any other questions, comments? Robert.
Mr. Chair?
Oh, I'm sorry.
If this is Lene, I'm just wondering if I could get a little feedback about that idea around providing disaggregated information by age.
Matt, is there any info on disaggregated data on age that we currently have?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Adler-Singer-Bretson, I can speak at least to the fact that we do create regional forecasts of the population by age. That is not my specialty. I think that would be more directly relevant to local communities in their comprehensive planning process. And so I don't know if Community Development Director Brajas would like to weigh in, or if anyone else is on the call, but or if we can just respond offline.
Maybe I can clarify that question a little better, because I'm not talking about projections. I'm talking about current information disaggregated by age that can be extrapolated into projections going forward. But I think that it also speaks to, we serve not just people over 18, we also serve people under 18, and that population looks very different and has different access to our systems and our processes and voice in our organization than the population over 18, but are just as impacted. So when I think of things like the climate strike or transit needs or park utilization and opportunities in regional facilities, clean, healthy environments, they're still a part of our population, but I think we only maybe see them in the context of projecting into the future, not in the context of that population is almost the antithesis of our adult 18 plus population. And I don't know that we think about that in our current planning activities and on a regular basis. Hopefully that clarifies that question a little bit.
It does, Councilmember Adler-Singer-Bretson. Thanks for the clarification. And to make sure I understand, it sounds like you're interested in not just the overall population by age, but also the very detailed cultural community approach that you mentioned.
Yes, I also think disability would be, and maybe some of those other kind of quintessential metrics might be helpful too by age as well.
Thank you.
Robert, you've been very patient.
Yeah, thanks, sure. No, I was fascinated listening to that, and just to really lift up what Councilmember Adler-Singer-Bretson was saying. You know, if you look at urban Indian communities, 70% of Native people live in cities and towns, not on reservations. If you go to 18 and under, that's 78%, and so that's a significant chunk of population that then brings different considerations for sort of how to serve and respond. But just really quickly, I want to thank Christine, Matt for their work, their team's work on this, and the presentation. And to the discussion questions, I think that your responses so far have been impressive and really reflective of what the council wanted to see. I look forward to the new data that'll be forward and will be available in December 2020, really supporting the mixed method of research. And to the questions about what research questions do I have about place and equity, and I'm not a researcher. I love data. I still respect the work that researchers do, but to me, there's something generational here, and I think we're starting to get at it when we look at historic covenants and some of the historic data, but even within the stories that we're gathering from different communities, what the generations might look like, what that might inform on the policy decisions that we make. I have a hunch that would inform us about things. A lot of things are generational. A lot of contributing factors to poverty are generational. So I don't have a specific question for you, Kristen, Matt, but something in the realm of generational impact. And to the final question about how we'd like to be support the community engagement, and we all have networks. We're all very familiar with our districts, but I think really engaging with the people who are doing the work at the community level. In my day job, I'm involved with a dozen or more different community engagement activities now, and I know there are people in the council who are involved in more than that, but there are really, really sort of grassroots, granular groups that can connect us with people, especially when we're getting into the more qualitative data and really seeking people's stories. There's some may be aware of a history of 35W South and the construction of 35W South that's going on that is getting granular into households and finding people who are aging, who are passing, or their descendants, and really getting these stories from inside their households. And it's fascinating work. And I'm not suggesting that we get that granular on everything, but, or that granular, but I just think there is something in this generational conversation that we can kind of find out from those kinds of qualitative data efforts. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Councilmember Wolf, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So first of all, I want to say I'm really glad that we're getting away from the ACPs. When I was on the council way back when we applied for the grant, and I didn't even want to apply for the grant because I didn't want to sell our decision-making ability for $5 million. And now we ended up with something that the communities didn't appreciate us focusing on, that we focused on, because the federal government told us we needed to do that because of the grant. So I'm glad that we're listening to the communities and getting away from that. I am also glad to see that there will be more reporting on disability status, but the census does a terrible job of collecting data on disability. They have all sorts of different categories that you can define for race and ethnicity, but there's like 5 really weird categories of disability that don't make any sense to me, and I wouldn't even know what boxes to check for most people. So we may be limited by bad data in that regard. It's really the census's data that they collect on disability is really in the dark ages compared to what they do on other things. I also want to talk a little bit about how the rural areas are very different. This is a very urban-centric discussion that we're having today. Things about neighborhood economies and retail and service gap analysis. There's parts of my district where you have to drive 10 or 15 miles to even find a store, a grocery store, any store. Elko New Market and any of the towns in my districts that are smaller than that have no grocery store. They might have a gas station, they might not. So, we have to remember that we are a large, very diverse region, and not everybody here is urban and has all of the urban services that some people take for granted. So that was the only other thing I wanted to say. Thanks.
Really important perspective. Thank you. Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, this is awesome. I really appreciate the approach. And I heard, I think, a comment about 3/4 of the way in, or maybe towards the end, about, hoping to have the resources. And, again, I just think because the council is pushing for information and data and turning that into what you've all said, strategies and action plans so that we're not just marking how things are, but we're trying to change the systems for the better for all people. And we do have a large region. So, that hopefully will help inform people that can have impact throughout the region, make better decisions, and first and foremost us, right? Because I think we've been doing a good job, but there are decisions, big decisions that we're making right now that we're still figuring our way through it. And I think when we really get to the next phase of this work, we'll be so much better informed throughout the council to, have a better platform to be more impactful in the work. I also am curious about a couple of things. How do we capture the homeless population in this? We know that it's increasing sharply given what we're going through now. And I don't necessarily, I'm not looking for an answer, but there are people who don't have households in the way we know them, most of us certainly. So I'm just, how do we capture the data about what's going on there? Because everybody matters, and so we want to figure out what we can do to impact that system, because they are in a system too, or a lack thereof, or something, right? And then I really do appreciate the comments that were made by other council members around development patterns. And again, the societal factors impacting those. And also, I just want to add another one, environmental factors that might be impacting those, and displacement patterns, but also, are we able to track when people are moving, forward with an upward mobility in their lives, and better understanding why and how, so that we can continue to support them, the systems that will propel those lifestyle changes. And also with the Economic Values Atlas and our economic development plans for the region that we're working on, are we able to continuously update the vocabulary and definitions that we use council-wide, so that when we are talking about terms or creating language around things that have meaning, that we're talking from a shared understanding of what that is? I think that's really important too, so that within the council and our various services that we provide throughout the region, we have a consistent language in that, and that as we try to break down the barriers between our services, whether it be environmental services, transportation, housing, they are all interrelated. And so I'm really excited then that we can have, through this work, the opportunity for an interwoven or connectedness between services, with a strategy and an implementation that lift people up, all people, to reduce disparities, increase equity, and access to prosperity for all people. So those are just some of my thoughts. I'm super excited about this. And the only last thing I was wondering, are we groundbreaking in this, or is this what we're seeing as the new norm in other regions throughout the country? And then just lastly, this will impact our 7-county region. I'm just wondering, do we know if there's anything at a broader statewide level? Certainly Greater MSP covers a 15-county metro region, the MSA, which is interestingly defined by 25% or more people traveling into the core metro area for work, which really gets to affordability and transportation issues. But I just think it's great work. And then I'm sorry, one last thing. So how do we also get this in the hands of the private sector in a way that they can use this, maybe from an, leadership, thought leadership, but, even to the hands of HR, because livable wages have to come into play, and the decisions that not only public and nonprofit sectors, but private businesses understanding, the region that they sit in and the impact they have as it relates to the opportunities and challenges that their workers face. We know some employers have stepped into the space of helping provide transportation options and transit passes and you know, but housing and all of that comes into play, but livable wages too, so that they understand they want workers to thrive. There's a role in this for them too.
Any comments on that, Matt or Kristen? The answers. Those are great questions.
Mr. Chair, I'm not really expecting like answers. That's just, you know, you brought forward things in my own mind. And so that, just so you're never surprised by what I'm thinking, right?
Well, and it's good to capture those thoughts because I think they'll help us.
I just have a very quick comment to share. I know we're running out of time here, but just a very quick thing to respond to is that we were actually groundbreaking in the use of areas of concentrated poverty, or the continued use of it, following our fair housing and equity assessment. We're the only metro region to actually continue to produce this and to kind of embed it in our policy work. Other metro areas that we looked at that completed those assessments, they may have developed other sort of metrics or other indices of opportunity or other things, but no one focused on concentrated poverty the same way that we did. So pulling it, I guess we're groundbreaking in that we both did that, and now we're trying to pull it back a little bit. So we have looked closely at what other metro regions have done after they've completed work like that, and we are unique in that respect. So but there's great opportunities, as all of you have mentioned, about how we can go forward from here, and how this conversation has really helped us zero in on digging much deeper, both on quantitative data and the promises that holds, but as well as the need to pair that with community partnerships and qualitative data and stories too. So thank you all so much for your comments. We really appreciate them.
And thank you, Kristen and Matt. And, it's true. We could be here all night because it is really rich material, and it was worth the wait. But we know this isn't the only time. We'll want to track and be your collaborators in this work. And as we think about not just the strategy, but how we are also leveraging, as Robert said, our various networks to help get this to be actually useful to turn the dial. Let's shift now. Thank you so much. But to our presentation from Charles and Katie about the BRT plan update. And we've all been reading the news. We understand some of the near-end lines that we've been advocating, but I think hearing this work as it goes farther out is really helpful for those that have not been engaged. I know many people on this council have been engaged, so I'm not sure, Katie or Charles, who's starting, but the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Chair Zelli. Good afternoon, council members. I'm Katie Roth. I'm the Assistant Director of BRT Projects, and I lead up the Arterial BRT program. Charles Carlson is also with me today, and we're both here to engage in conversation with you about an update around Network Next, which is Metro Transit's 2040 plan for service improvements, and notably for today's discussion, Arterial BRT expansion. Next slide, please, Greg. All right, and so, as the chair mentioned, while we've been in communication about this project with many of you over the past year, it's been over a year since we've been before the full council with a formal project update. And of course, during that time, a lot has changed about the way we do our work and the way we can engage with our community. And so today's update will focus on how we've adapted the Network Next process to the changes of 2020. We'll share the updated process and schedule for the work advancing now, which really focuses in on Arterial BRT. We'll share the work to date to identify the BRT lines for consideration, and we'll talk through the current phase of engagement and our next steps. Next slide, please. So first, I'd like to remind you all what Network Next is. It's a 20-year vision for the future of the Metro Transit bus network. And as is shown here, it's focused on expanding that existing bus network, identifying a series of incremental ways to deliver improvements and also estimating the additional resources it would require between now and 2040 to deliver this vision. This is an unfunded expansion plan at its core. As we began work on this plan in 2019, the intent was that these improvements would all be directed by a guiding framework, which would be a robust planning document made up of 3 core inputs. Much of our staff's work in 2019 and in early 2020 was focused on these 3 inputs here: reviewing Met Council policy, analyzing the performance of the bus network, and conducting a robust engagement process to hear from our riders and the communities we serve about their experiences and about their priorities for the transit network. So while I'll be sharing how our process has changed, we've laid a lot of the groundwork to carry each of these 3 inputs forward into our adapted Network Next plan. Next slide, please. There will be 2 key outcomes of Network Next when it's completed. The first will be a local and express bus network for 2040 that fulfills the TPP requirement for Metro Transit to produce a service improvement plan, which identifies improvements for existing routes as well as areas, new routes for areas without service today, and an updated arterial BRT network for the lines to come after those currently in development. Of course, we've got the A line and C line in operation, the D line, B line, and E line in various stages of development, but we are looking to chart the course for the F line and beyond. And importantly, Metro Transit needs to identify the F line in the coming months to position it within TAB's timeline to be allocated $25 million in funding through the regional solicitation process. We also seek to identify other near-term lines at the same time, along with identifying a broader set for implementation by 2040. Next slide, please. This slide shows the changes that we've made to the Network Next process. Initially, as I mentioned, we had planned to develop that guiding framework from our 2019 efforts to then inform the 2040 local and express bus network, from which we would identify the arterial BRT candidates and evaluate those toward the F-line project decision. But with the pandemic upending the transit system generally, but less so on BRT routes and the core urban routes that we are studying for BRT implementation, we adapted our process to focus on BRT in 2020, and we plan to resume bus network planning more generally in 2021. This decision really was the combination of an intent to meet that TAB deadline and also looking at that comparative stability of the ridership we've seen on BRT in our core local routes. We do feel pretty confident in the ongoing role of BRT, and we're ready to advance more planning on that front. Next slide, please. Next slide, please.
Katie, are they not? It looks like it's advancing. Katie, is it not the slide you wanted?
Oh, I'm sorry. Can folks hear me now?
Yes.
All right, I think I'm frozen here. Greg, if you could go back 1 slide, I apologize for that. All right, great, thank you. So with the changing order of operations of Network Next, we also need some more time to adequately engage community around this work. And so based on the events of 2020 over the summer, we brought a request to TAB to defer the selection of the F-line from the point of project selection in December, moving that until around April of next year. So in August, we presented this request to TAB as an info item along with some of our initial BRT network identification results and kicked off our regional engagement around those corridors. Our plan would be that in December, at the point of the regional solicitation project selection, we'd instead share that top tier of corridors from which the F-line project could be selected. Following December, we'd continue our community engagement into the first quarter and bring the F-line to the council for selection in March, culminating in TAB confirming its investment in April and reflecting that in the upcoming TIP in the spring of 2021. This request was warmly received on the basis of the additional time it will afford to engage some of the communities around our BRT priorities, and this action is currently proceeding in parallel toward TAD's September 16th meeting. With this, Greg, if you could move to the next slide.
Okay, thank God I don't.
Thank you. So there's a lot of detail on this schedule, but generally what I'd like to draw your attention to in this schedule are the lines highlighted in the light yellow. Based on that pending TAB action, we are able to build in 4 opportunities for engaging the public and the communities we serve around BRT priorities between now and April. Starting with the agency-wide work we kicked off last month around listening and learning to our riders to learn about their needs through the crisis of 2020. So currently in September here, we're heading into a month-long outreach period around the initial screening of potential BRT corridors, which we'll share more about later in this presentation. And then we plan to further engage around the top tier this winter, and then coming back in February with the recommendations for the F, G, and H lines prior to Council's action in March to select that F line. Next slide, please. All right, so pivoting now from the process adaptation we've been going through to the actual content of the plan as we're focusing on BRT, I want to bring us to the core principles shaping how we are developing the arterial BRT network. Since that guiding framework document will be put on hold until next year, we drew upon those 3 core inputs, the policy, the network performance, and the engagement outcomes, to develop 4 arterial BRT principles shown here. These guided the identification of corridors to date for potential BRT investment and will also form the basis for evaluating those corridors in the coming months. So as shown here, they are to advance equity and reduce regional racial disparities, to build on success of our network to grow ridership, to design a network that supports a transit-oriented lifestyle, and to ensure the long-term sustainable growth of the bus network. Next slide, please. So then into the process we'll be using to plan for these lines, this consists of 4 steps built on those principles with the public input and feedback steps along the way that I previously mentioned. So first we identified about 20 potential corridors for arterial BRT, and next we screened them down to the most promising BRT candidate corridors to advance. We narrowed this to a set of about 10, which we think reflects approximately the number of lines that could be reasonably implemented between 2025 and 2040, given additional funding. And today's presentation and our current engagement activities really focus on these 2 steps, the first 2 steps here. The coming steps this fall, we'll develop the 10 or so corridors further in order to conduct a more detailed evaluation of their costs, ridership, and other benefits in order to arrive at 3 tiers, with 3 to 4 corridors for near-term implementation, another 3 to 4 for midterm implementation, and 3 or so for the longer-term implementation within the 2040 planning horizon. The last step will be to prioritize these corridors over this winter, working with our local partners to identify how to prioritize BRT implementation alongside other planned street projects, with other planned transit ways, and other community changes underway. Next slide, please. Turning now to the corridors themselves. This is reflective of that first step in the process. We identified 19 initial corridors for review based largely on Metro Transit's high frequency network, other high ridership corridors, places we've studied previously for arterial BRT, and with an eye toward network balance, both thinking about the different parts of the region as well as different parts of the bus network. So for example, not just looking at radial routes coming into and out of downtown, but at crosstown connections as well, reflecting a lot of what we heard in our public engagement last year. Next slide, please. So for each of these, we applied a screening criteria set based on those principles to narrow the list from 19 to 11. Starting from the left, I'll just kind of go through these quickly here. As we look to ensure the long-term sustainable growth of the bus network, one of the things we know is that only a small portion of our bus ridership is for a 9-to-5 commute purpose. So we're really looking at service levels in the midday as a way to gauge where investment in BRT would be successful in the long term in terms of where service has been able to support a lot of different trip purposes. Corridors that have been able to sustain that frequent bus service are scoring more highly here than those without that. Next, we looked at where ridership is strong today to see how many people would benefit from BRT improvements and where there's a proven market for transit investment. But then we're also looking at the potential. So moving to the right here, the corridor propensity to use transit is looking more at who is there, not necessarily who is on the bus, but looking at a ridership recipe for areas of sorts. So population density, employment density, the intersection density, and where vehicles are available to people living there. And then looking at planned land use, we're getting even a little more potential, looking at the comprehensive plans of the municipalities that these corridors are in, and generally assessing the transit supportiveness of those plans. And finally, we looked at the proportion of people of color and people experiencing poverty who are riding buses on these routes today. I think we've looked at a lot of different metrics to assess how we can serve populations that are the focus of the council's equity policies. And while there are a lot of different measures that could be applied here at this screening level, we really wanted to focus on who was on the bus, because we know that when we look at place-based measures, such as ACP 50s or other types of measures like that, we see that it's not necessarily reflective of the people riding transit in areas that may take them to jobs and other types of opportunities, not just residential population.
Chair,
next slide, please.
I'm on my phone. This is Councilmember Atlas Ingebretson. Can I?
Sure. Do you have a quick question?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if for future, could we separate out the advancing equity or just separate out. One of the things that's just really challenging is when people of color are always associated with poverty. And I know that's not the intent behind this portion, but visually it's kind of what's happening. And so just wondering if it's something that could be separated out, kind of like maybe how the category to the left is separated out, unless that percentage has to be 30. Maybe I'm misunderstanding that. Are they the same thing or are they separate? Thank you.
Mr. Chair, Council Member, just to respond to that question before we move on, I think in listening to the previous presentation, certainly that's something that I was reflecting on in the presentation of this material here, the way we can improve our work and seek to be more consistent with the new direction we want to head in this communications realm, as well as in an analysis realm. Looking at this, we have calculated these two measures as individual metrics and then are presenting them as 30% of the overall score together. And so how we communicate that in this material is reflective of having both of those pieces, but merging them eventually toward a single principle of advancing equity and reducing racial disparities. As we think about going forward, we will be conducting more evaluation and applying additional criteria. And I think that's something that we can seek to incorporate in that next screening going forward.
I guess I think it's not about incorporating it. I think it's about how you're presenting the information. Is it that people of color are also poverty, or you just lumped the two groups together?
Councilmember, the answer to that is that the two metrics, measuring a group of people and identifying how many of them are people of color, and separately, how many are experiencing poverty, in terms of representing this as a single piece of our evaluation puzzle, we have put the two side by side and are representing them as a scaled score across a 100% score. And I can provide further detail around that as we're tracking this forward here.
Mr. Chair, can I just do a quick follow-up question on that?
Yeah, sure.
Just again, briefly, on the equity score, Katie, is that equity score, because, you know, it's for transportation, obviously, with BRT, but is that equity score then consistent throughout transportation planning in other areas of work that we're doing? And, you know, because we score things in housing for equity, and I was on a meeting earlier where it's coming through the regional solicitation that there'll be score for equity as it relates to some housing along routes. And then we've got equity scoring here. And I'm just wondering, is there some cross-departmental discussion on how equity scoring works or how it comes together?
Chair and Councilmember Johnson, that's a great question. And I would just say in short that this is the approach that was taken here was not the same exactly as, for example, what our Service Development Department brought in reviewing some service changes and applying an equity lens to that. I think given the regional scale of what we were looking at and also seeking to move away from the straight application of the ACP 50s, this was a methodology that drew upon some of our most granular data in terms of who our riders report themselves to be in our transit onboard survey, and allowed us to, as we were looking at this, to best capture who is on the bus from a race and ethnicity and income perspective.
Mr. Chair?
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When you're talking about the equity scores related to TAB outlines every cycle for the regional solicitation. They are looking at it from their perspective and defining what or how the equity scores what makeup they are for the regional solicitation score. And that can differ for different, whether it's for like the roads and bridges or transit projects. We as council factor in things differently to represent what we're looking for as we are recommending some of these lines. So like when this particular line moves on to TAB, it will factor in what our version of what we're looking at for equity, but TAB does their own process as it relates to the regional solicitation. And once that's released as a council, we can either concur or turn it back to them.
All right, thanks. That's helpful.
All right. So as we move forward then, after applying that technical scoring, we also took a more qualitative look at a couple of the high scoring corridors to capture things that really didn't show up well in those metrics. And we looked at how people on those routes are using the bus today, and looked at the route design to identify whether building BRT in these corridors could be successful in meeting the core goals of speeding up the service and accomplishing that rapid service while also continuing to meet customers' needs. This resulted in 2 of our corridors in Minneapolis being removed from future consideration, the 2nd Street Northeast corridor on the left side of the screen, and the Franklin University, or the Route 2 corridor, which serves the neighborhoods ringing downtown Minneapolis. Both of these routes follow fairly circuitous routing patterns today with a lot of turns, which limits how streamlined and rapid we'd be able to make the service here with BRT. And in each of these cases, the routes are good performers and serve our customer needs well because they connect a lot of different pockets of these areas. They perform an important connecting function in the transit network, but they're not a great fit for the limited stop rapid model of arterial BRT. Despite that, they remain really good candidates for other types of service and stop improvements, but we did not want to carry them forward further into this process. Next slide, please. So with those 2 corridors screened out, we ended up with the 11 corridors here listed in green to advance into the next stage. And I'll ask Greg if you could move it to the next slide. The map, I think, does a better job of showing this here. The 11 corridors are shown in the blue lines here on this map. And you'll see there's a combination of some of those core routes radiating in and out of downtowns, a couple of suburban connections, crosstown connections, and a balance of where these corridors are across the region. A couple of notes about this set of corridors as we're looking at this map. First, you'll note that several of these lines overlap with places that other types of transit improvements are being considered. In the case of the West 7th Street corridor, we're working closely with Ramsey County to consider how the concurrent advancement of the Riverview Modern Streetcar project should affect how we consider that corridor. We're also working closely with Minneapolis around their past streetcar planning work in the Nicollet Central corridor. And there are several potential corridors in the Northwest Metro that are shown connecting with the Blue Line light rail extension, which we have taken as the baseline in our planning process. It's shown on the map here and has been the baseline as we've approached this. These bus improvements have the potential to really complement that rail line. And as efforts begin to update that rail alignment for the Blue Line extension, we'll also be coordinating those developments with this work. And lastly, you'll note that several of these lines are already reflected in the TPP and others are new and are not reflected in there. As this process concludes next spring, one of the steps is that we'll be working with MTS staff to reflect the outcomes of Network Next planning into a future update of the TPP for the Council's consideration. So yesterday, we launched a project website and are kicking off public engagement now, focused on receiving input on these 3 items listed here. So generally hearing comments on these corridors, asking about what's most important to consider in the evaluation, and looking with an eye toward how we should prioritize these BRT improvements. As we go on to the next slide, please, I'll end with a snapshot of the engagement that we're doing right now. As the chair noted in communications over the past couple of weeks, our engagement plans these days need to be mainly virtual. So we're going to be relying a lot on a robust and accessible web presence at metrotransit.org for this project. It's not listed here because that site just went live yesterday, but I'll go ahead and pop it into the chat box so that you have the direct link to this website. Our main tool there is an interactive story map that folks can use to review the lines and respond to a survey across different devices. And we're pointing to these tools with social media starting later this week, and also have plans to develop virtual meeting content later this month, in addition to engaging a lot of the organizations we've worked with in the past to get the word out about this new engagement opportunity. Recognizing, though, that many folks are stretched thin and lacking a lot of capacity to engage, we're trying to make it as easy as possible to engage and tailoring our approach to different groups' needs. Everything from being able to participate in a meeting if folks would like to organize their constituencies around this discussion, all the way to just providing a link that can be passed along or a social media post. And finally, we're drawing upon the enthusiasm we heard at TAB and from our local agency staff partners to provide those folks with a plug-and-play toolkit of sorts to help engage their own local communities. And we'd be happy to share that with council members as well. So with that, Charles and I are happy to enter into discussion, receive your questions, and I'll also note that Robin Kaufman is here with us today. Should you have any further questions about this engagement plan or other engagement plans Metro Transit is leading right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. And you covered a lot of material, so I know some of it is familiar, but a lot of it is new for some of us, and it's robust. So, and Charles, Robin, you're here. Deb, did you want to set this up at all and mention a few things?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I really want to thank Katie and Charles and their staff for how they've looked at this. I think it was very important to take a breath and try and separate out the 2 different priorities of Network Next, which is sort of that long-term plan. We really need to look at that a little differently given where we are with the transit system now, but still keeping a focus on how we want to prioritize the ABRT system, but making sure that we really do the proper public engagement. That is key to, we've been able to do that and have gotten better and better at it with our ABRT lines. In fact, I think it's, both we did it well with the A line. I think we did it better with the C line, and I fully expect we'll keep that pattern going. So I'm really, really thankful to them. I'm also thankful to TAB, who really came together with this and really solidified their commitment towards dedicating the $25 million in the regional solicitation towards a ABRT line, while still giving us enough, an extended period of time to really make sure that we're looking at everything, getting the right public engagement, and also just being real thoughtful in our process. So I think the process has played out very well. Like I said, TAB was, I was very pleased with the outcome of TAB, and it was really resounding across the group. So it's very well done and much appreciated to both of you and your staffs for putting these things together. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Barber, and thanks for your work on this as well. Other comments, questions for the team?
Mr. Chair, it's Sue. I have a question.
Sue,
thanks.
Go ahead.
I'm wondering, and perhaps you covered this and I missed it, but I'm wondering, there is a route from Woodbury to the Maplewood Mall that has been designated yellow, so it's at this time it's not going forward, and I understand that. I think I probably get the reasoning behind it too, but it happens to, I think from what I can tell on the map, it happens to go by Century College, and one of the things that I have heard a lot about in the last year and a half since the appointment to the council is the need for transportation to Century. As one of their board members frequently says, and I'm frequently reminded of her comment, many of their students are one bad car battery away from being able to get to school. And so I continue to be concerned about access for our post-secondary students, and in particular access for the Century College folks. And to the extent that we can keep that in mind with additional planning, I'd really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I can address that question. And thank you for sharing that. I think, you know, we continue to be interested in finding improvements along Century Avenue, and we heard from Washington County the interest to look at it for BRT in this evaluation. I think what we're finding based on where the scores have come out so far is that it may not be quite the time for BRT yet, and I think we're seeing that. However, we have done a couple other things. One is that Metro Transit put in a regional solicitation application to improve that route. And obviously the scoring is still ahead on whether that might get funded. But at the same time, we have the remaining balance of the Network Next effort to look at local and express bus improvements. So whether through the active solicitation consideration or the upcoming local and express bus network planning, we do see that as an opportunity to continue building the network and see that destination in particular and the connection to Century College as one that will grow over time, particularly as we bring other transit ways online like the Gold Line and the Rush Line that really will fill in that network northeast of St. Paul. So really appreciate that comment.
Thank you, Charles.
Other thoughts, questions? Reva?
Thank you, Chair Zelli. I heard that council members could request the toolkit, and I'd be interested in taking a look at that. I'm really excited to see that Central Avenue from downtown Minneapolis to Northtown scored high on page 14. I, at one point, tried to look into taking a bus from Northtown, and the time that it would take was just so long. So having a BRT option, I'm sure a lot of people are going to be happy about the fact that scored high. Looking forward to seeing how this goes. I know that this is not it. There are other corridors that we would like to see advance, in particular in the northern part of my district in Brooklyn Park. You know, you've heard about the fact that we don't have the reverse commutes and how long it takes for people to get through the city. So I'm hoping that maybe that will advance in the future. And I know you talked about the potential opportunities with the light rail project. So hopefully that'll be considered in the next phase. If you want to speak to that, please do.
All right, thanks for that comment. Any other thoughts, questions? Clearly, we're building on the success of the A line and C line, and I want you, Charles, to know I was wearing my A line T-shirt this weekend. You know, anticipation of this meeting. So.
Fantastic.
Well, if there's no other questions, this is as Councilmember Chambliss has pointed out, there's a lot of intersecting parts of this puzzle, and it's not all represented just by BRT. There's also the transitway initiatives that we're looking at and advancing, particularly in that Botno area, and then of course in the Riverview area. I want to thank the whole council. This was a lot of information, and it also continues. So there's no other questions or comments. It's still a beautiful evening, so I hope you enjoy your day. And watching you who are sitting outside, I'm jealous. We will see you very soon. Take care, and this meeting's adjourned.